Morning, everybody. I'm Professor Simon Jackman, the Chief Executive Officer at the United States Study Centre here at the University of Sydney, which stands on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people, part of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. We're delighted to be co-hosting today's event, pardon me, with our great friends and partners at the Asia Society Australia to talk about the state of Indo-Pacific strategy and its evolution under the Biden administration, and to assess that evolution. Look, just a little bit of background from me so we can cut to the chase and get into this terrific panel that I'll introduce in a moment. Certainly for us at the US Study Centre, with a focus on US foreign policy and strategic policy more broadly, its implications for Australian equities, the question about where Indo-Pacific strategy lands, US Indo-Pacific strategy lands, is just one of the central questions being pursued here at the United States Study Centre. I think it's fair to say that we have all collectively witnessed a strategic reawakening, if you will, in the United States, a reprioritization of the Indo-Pacific and understanding that that is the locus of now great power rivalry, of where the future, frankly, of the planet is going to be played out, and over relatively short time frames. That strategic reawakening, though, if you will, in the United States, how is that translating or not into policy? And in a way that, again, we look at with our hats firmly on as Australian-based analysts, interrogating that question from the perspective of what's in Australian national interests. I remember, I think I attribute this form of words to Kevin Rudd, that under the Trump administration, the United States had an attitude about China. It did not yet have a policy or a strategy. And I think the question is, let's change the word China there to Indo-Pacific, and to some extent, does the same hold true for the Biden administration with respect to the Indo-Pacific? That's the broad frame for today's conversation, and it's perfect that the United States Study Centre is joined today with experts and analysts from the Asia Society based here in Australia to help us interrogate that proposition. Let me briefly introduce the participants on today's session. To moderate, we're joined by Emma Connors, who was the Southeast Asia correspondent from the Australian Financial Review, and previously she was the editor of the Perspectives and Review sections for the paper. Richard Maude, we'll be hearing from Richard shortly. Richard, of course, is the Executive Director of Policy at the Asia Society Australia and a Senior Fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute, and of course, for many years, senior official inside the Australian government and the bureaucracy with deep experience in foreign policy and national security. In particular, I got to know Richard in his capacity as Deputy Secretary, Indo-Pacific Group in DFAT. And of course, he also served as a senior representative of Australia at the East Asia Summit. Richard's credits also include leading the task force that generated a really important document, and I remember its launch and the prep quite well, that Richard was deeply involved in. That is, of course, the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper. We're also joined by Elina Noor, who's the Director, Political Security Affairs and Deputy Director. And of course, I misspeak. She is not joining us from Melbourne or Sydney or Canberra. She's joining us from Washington, DC. And we're delighted to have Elina on the call. Her work focuses on security developments in Southeast Asia, pardon me, governance and technology, and preventing and countering violent extremism. From the US Study Centre, two of my colleagues will be joining us today, and in Susannah Patton, who's with the Foreign Policy and Defence Program here at the United States Study Centre, and has recently joined the US Study Centre after a career in government, principally as a senior analyst in the Southeast Asia branch at the Office of National Intelligence, Australia's peak intelligence assessment agency. And also joining us from the US Study Center, Ash Townshend, who directs our foreign policy and defense program here at the United States Study Center, which covers a vast array of issues. Clearly, as I said in the intro, most of what we do, most of what I know about this topic comes from the great work by Ash and his colleagues here at the US Study Center. Questions about Indo-Pacific strategy and the development of it out of the US, its implications for Australian equities, is core business for Ash and his colleagues, and delighted to have both Ash and Susannah from the center on the call today. And with that, I'm going to hand over proceedings to Emma Connors from the Fin Review to lead us through the balance of our time. Thanks, Emma.
Let's jump right in, as Simon suggested. This is such an important topic. We've had 10 months now for Biden White House, so we're getting a bit of a picture emerging. There's a lot that's happened in those 10 months. So I'll start by asking Ashley and Elina to give us sort of the context. You know, what does the US Indo-Pacific China strategy look under President Biden, and what should its objectives be? And how different is it to the Trump administration's approach? Ashley, perhaps you could kick us off.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks all for those kind introductions. It's great to be partnering with our friends at Asia Society again today. And Richard, Elina, we're really grateful to share the stage with you. So, I mean, this is a difficult question in many ways because, of course, the Biden administration, despite being in office for 10 months, has not yet articulated what its Indo-Pacific strategy will be, and certainly hasn't produced at least a public policy document on its Indo-Pacific strategy, which is much anticipated at the moment and which we hope to see in the coming months. But looking at the administration's rhetoric, going into to office, President Biden spoke very broadly about the United States being back as a leader internationally. And of course, at that time, he prioritized issues of the Indo-Pacific and issues of competition with China in his and his senior cabinet members' official discourse. But we have now watched for 10 months how that is translated into policy reality. And I think it's fair to say that the region is still left wanting certainly more information, but clearly more investment and prioritization and resourcing by the United States when it comes to investing in competition with China here in the Indo-Pacific right now. It's not all bad news. The administration has done a really important and good job in restoring, if you like, the status quo of US policy in the region following the tumultuous years of the Trump administration. In particular, when it comes to US relations with its allies and partners here in Asia. The Biden administration has, as we would have expected, and as they said coming in, really sought to restore those bilateral relationships. In the case of Japan and South Korea, we have new host agreements in place for US forces. In the case of the Philippines, whose relationship with the United States has languished under both Duterte, but really through the Trump years as well, beginning actually in the Obama administration, that has been restored with a new visiting forces agreement and a restoration of an arrangement that will in time strengthen or have the potential to strengthen America's military position in the Philippines. And of course, with Australia, the country that perhaps fared best through the Trump years, the Biden administration has continued with that alliance integration agenda. We'll talk about AUKUS a bit later, and has certainly continued to prioritize many of the issues, not all, but many of the issues that matter to the US-Australia alliance. And broadly across all of those partnerships, the Biden administration has taken, if you like, a liberal internationalist frame to restoring relationships in Asia. That is to say, in contrast to Donald Trump, this administration has brought the United States back to the forefront of pandemic response and economic recovery. It has begun to champion human rights issues again, climate change, engage with multilateral architecture, and so forth. So there is this sense of a holistic return of the United States to the status quo ante, if you like. But it's what's not there that is a concern. The Biden administration, when it comes to competing with China, and it's rearranged the deck chairs a little bit, shifting the rhetoric from great power competition to strategic competition with China, it has really invested most in globalizing this competition and investing in the economic and technological foundations of American power for this competition, both enterprises which are important, but both enterprises which will take some years to bear fruit and certainly to pay strategic dividends in Asia. So there are initiatives like bringing Europe more into the Indo-Pacific set of architecture, finding ways to bring Europe into infrastructure financing in the region through the Build Back Better world, prioritizing as well the long-term strengthening of future capabilities of the US military. And what it hasn't done is focused in terms of the immediacy of the challenge that China presents in the region, concrete resources on turning its reality, its rhetoric rather, into reality. So when you look at the United States economic agenda, again, an issue we'll touch on in a moment, it doesn't have one when it comes to a trade strategy for the Indo-Pacific. When you look at the way the United States is preparing for potential deterrence or military challenges with China, it is not investing the resources in US position and US posture, logistics and so forth in the region, as sort of exemplified by the Pacific Deterrence Initiative's treatment by this administration. And look, just finally here, I think you can see the difference here in terms of two of the administration's signature accomplishments in Asia so far. On the one hand, you have AUKUS, got a lot of headlines, has been touted as a major step up of the administration in Asia, but really is an agreement that's going to take decades to bear fruit when it comes to the submarine component. And at the same time, you've had the elevation of the Quad to a leaders level. And again, much trumpeted internationally with regards to the Quad's new and emerging role in critical technologies, in climate change, in infrastructure financing. But again, things which are important that will take a long time to bite. So I think what we want to see from the administration is really much more investment in what's going to matter over the 5 to 10 year horizon, not just in the 2030s.
Some more meat on the immediate bones, perhaps. Elina, would you like to jump in there?
Yeah, thank you for having me in this conversation. Just maybe to piggyback on Ashley's comments, I think there are some key distinguishing factors about the elements of what we've seen so far with the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. And we've seen these elements in, as Ashley said, in statements, but also in the interim national security strategy. And I think we're all anticipating a full-blown national security strategy sometime next year. And some of the distinguishing elements, I think, that have been largely welcomed by Southeast Asia are the return to multilateralism, a bit more of a nuanced approach to competition with China. So there's been a lot of muted messaging in terms of this strategic competition, nominally at least when the administration communicates with Southeast Asia. But also this, I think importantly, a sense of humility about the US's own flawed system of democracy in its foreign policy approach. I think what the Indo-Pacific strategy should be depends on who you ask, of course, right? And from Southeast Asia's vantage point, I think there are going to be questions about what this values-based approach, this emphasis or return to emphasis on democracy and human rights, how that will play out in the region, particularly since many countries in Southeast Asia have been on the receiving end of a lot of preaching about human rights and democracy in the past, not always well received. And whether this muted rhetoric about competition with China will manifest, how it will manifest in the longer term as we move forward, particularly with arrangements like AUKUS and the Quad. So let me leave it at that. I know we're short on time.
Sure. Well, now that we've brought up China, Richard, perhaps you could talk us through how you see the China policy, Biden's China policy interacting with what we know so far about the Indo-Pacific approach and what could be the trajectory of US-China relations.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. Look, like Biden's Indo-Pacific policy, the administration's China policy is very much a work in progress. But I actually think that US-China relations are at a really interesting point right now and worth paying attention to. So the Biden team came to office with what's sometimes described as a counter-compete, cooperate model. So they said that they were going to compete toughly with China. Biden talked about extreme competition, but they also wanted to find some areas of cooperation and to put guardrails around the competition to keep it constrained to some degree. So you often hear the Biden team talk about the importance of America responsibly managing, quote unquote, competition with China. And over the course of the 10 months of the Biden administration so far, we have seen quite a lot of the competitive element. Ashley mentioned the Quad and AUKUS. There's a whole bunch of things, other things with other allies and partners. There's a range of domestic policies, many of which have been continued since the Trump administration, that go into that competitive basket. But we haven't seen really any success at cooperation. But I think what's interesting about the last month or so is that we've now seen quite a lot of diplomacy from the Biden administration. And in reasonably quick succession, we've had a phone call between President Xi and Biden. We've seen the plea deal that allowed Huawei's CFO Meng Wanzhou to return to China. There's been a resumption of trade and defense talks. We had an almost cordial meeting between Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, and Yang Jiechi. And that's led to an announcement that there'll be a virtual bilateral summit between Xi and Biden at the end of the year. And, you know, some of this tends to jar a bit with the competitive elements in the Biden administration's approach, and has led to some argument in Washington that the administration's China policy is incoherent or a bit muddled. But what I think it actually is, it's the inevitable result of a model where the Biden team is saying that US-China relations will not be either good or bad at any one point, but a mixture of both at once. But I think the really interesting question is this going to go anywhere? You know, is this going to lead to a significant breakthrough or a sustained lowering of the tension in the bilateral relationship? Will it open up productive new areas of cooperation? Or is it simply a short-term pause and tactical recalibration? I think, well, the honest answer is we don't know. The odds are stacked against a big breakthrough, I think. There's the structural nature of the competition that's baked in pretty hardly now. The domestic politics in both America and China really work against a big breakthrough. The complete lack of trust on both sides, the confidence in Beijing that America is a declining power and that compromise by China is both unnecessary and potentially dangerous for the party. All of those factors will push the needle towards the competitive end of the dial. But for all of that, it's worth watching. If they did manage to work out a framework for this idea of competitive coexistence, it's a low probability but high consequence event, including for Australian policy. And our policy needs to stay flexible enough to accommodate that possibility.
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking, I mean, it was only in March when we had that incredibly heated meeting between US and China officials at Alaska, where there was walkouts and heated words. So certainly the tone has changed quite a lot since then. Let's consider economic engagement. So it's time to enter the wonderful world of acronyms. And Susannah, if I could perhaps ask you just to give us sort of a brief précis of where we are. I mean, as you know, we've got now the CTPP emerging along with the RCEP. Is the US crafting an effective economic strategy for the Indo-Pacific? And what should it do? How should it ensure it's not being left behind, seeing it's not part of either of those agreements?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, sadly, it's a fairly short and simple story, which is that the administration has been studied in its disinterest of regional trade arrangements, most notably the CPTPP, the successor agreement to the TPP. By its words, so talking about a worker-centric trade policy, and by its deeds, like letting Trade Promotion Authority lapse. And even more modest proposals, like for a digital trade agreement, seem to have been bogged down and come to nothing. And I think even more importantly, perhaps, is what the administration is not saying. We're not hearing that kind of rhetoric that we used to hear from the US about the idea that Asia is the most economically dynamic region in the world, and the US is going to be there for its own benefit and the benefit of the region. That sense is really lacking. And without that, you know, it's very hard to think of an alternative way for the administration to get a kind of cut through and positive vision and traction in the region, because other initiatives like on infrastructure or vaccines or pointing to private sector investment are going to be bitsy, and they're not really going to respond to the sort of the need to compete with China on the economic questions. Now, some people hope that sort of after the passage of the administration's domestic agenda, or after midterm elections, or in a second Biden term, things will change. I think, you know, we can't predict the future, but one thing I think is pretty clear, which is that if it does change, it will be because there's a degree of bipartisan recognition in the US that they need to have an economic strategy to compete with China. And I think the role of US allies and partners like Australia, Japan, other influential voices in the region will be critical in making sure that the regional economic piece stays on the agenda, and that there's still an expectation that Washington does bring something to the table. And there's a couple of opportunities to do that. The US hosting of APEC in 2023 is a good kind of reference point to encourage the US to build something by that point. And of course, China's application to join the CPTPP is also something that should give pause to policymakers in Washington.
Well, certainly Australia's been very involved in both those agreements. So I guess that is one point where we do depart from the US. But actually, can I ask you sort of to tie that back with how is the US overall Indo-Pacific strategy coalescing with Australia's interests? You know, the big acronym in the room is AUKUS. So how does the establishment of that new agreement and the new force posture initiatives, I love that term, under the alliance, you know, how will Australia be able to effectively maintain its own strategic autonomy? Some have argued that we're now inextricably tied with the US.
So on AUKUS and the force posture initiatives, I might just comment briefly on that part. You know, I've been surprised by the commentary on how AUKUS and the force posture initiatives might corner Australia's strategic autonomy. And the reason for my surprise is really because they're things that Australia has pushed for. They're not things that have been thrust upon us. And really, if you go back and you look at the larger arc of Australia's role and Australia's interest when it comes to US military presence in the region and US military support, or the bilateral military relationship between the US and Australia, there's actually quite a lot of continuity, although there is going to be a step change in capability. And the reason I say that is Australia has for a long time, and it's in numerous Australian government documents, including those that that my colleague here this morning, Richard, has been involved in, that Australia wants the strongest possible US forward presence in Asia. It's also a long-standing element of Australian government policy to work with the United States in terms of strengthening force posture initiatives here in Australia, in part out of a recognition, and a recognition that has been proven correct, by the way, that US force posture initiatives in Australia are also a net benefit for investment in Australian military infrastructure and Australian military interoperability gains. So that's my reason for surprise. Now, of course, when it comes to the submarines themselves and the uncertainty over, you know, will it be an American-made boat? Will it be a British-made boat? I'll put my bet on a British-made boat with American agreement for the sharing of nuclear propulsion technology. But irrespective of that, the terms and conditions around that particular capability acquisition will obviously need to be negotiated properly to ensure sufficient Australian capacity to service and maintain ships here in Australia. But I think the announcement at Osman this year around not just air, land and sea enhancements of bilateral US-Australian military activities and initiatives, but the fourth one on that list, and the most important in my view, the establishment of a combined maintenance, logistics and sustainment facility here in Australia, is actually exactly that. It is about the grafting here in Australia of the technical skills, the know-how, the arrangements enabling legislation and material in this country to be able to do more ourselves. And so I view that really as the United States giving Australia, empowering Australia in a way that Australia has sought to be empowered and strengthen itself for a long time. And I would just note there that if that is the direction that the Biden administration is going to go with other allies in the region, and if it's going to go in that direction on issues that are not as long-term as a submarine deal, so in the Australian case, the sharing of technology to allow Australia to manufacture long-range missiles here in this country, which is something the Australian government wants to do. In the case of South Korea, we've already seen the Americans lift restrictions on the South Koreans to test and use longer-range systems themselves. Then we are in a different era where the United States is more willing to see allies have a greater degree of control and independence in their military capabilities than before. And I think that's a net benefit for all.
Just to pick up on that point about how the US might strengthen its cooperation in various ways with others in the region. Elina, could I ask you to give us a brief on what defines Biden's Southeast Asia policy? And has the US been doing enough to counter Chinese ambition and influence in this region? And we just had this week the Malaysian and Indonesian foreign ministers coming out and voicing their concern about AUKUS, and they have previously done so about the Quad. So clearly there is a bit of uneasiness in the region, and perhaps you could just fill us in on whether that would be expected in the context of the overall Biden policy towards Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I'll try a lot to unpack there. So Southeast Asia policy, I think, again, we're still waiting for the defining elements of what this policy will look like. But to the Biden administration's credit, I think there is and has been demonstrated sincerity in listening to the region. And a lot of that listening has actually borne fruit at this early stage, if you consider 10 months into the administration, early stages. And what I mean by that is that there have been efforts to allay some of the anxieties and concern in Southeast Asia about the administration's policy towards ASEAN in particular. So there have been a lot of statements about upholding and supporting ASEAN centrality. But that allaying of concerns, I think, only goes so far in reality. And as you pointed out, Emma, there have been some anxieties about what arrangements like the Quad and AUKUS mean for ASEAN in particular, and the centrality and unity of ASEAN. As we all know, many on this call and participants tuning in have also been watching the region very carefully. Southeast Asia is an incredibly diverse region with various perspectives about and levels of comfort about some of these arrangements, like the Quad and AUKUS. You mentioned Indonesia and Malaysia, Emma. There are others who have voiced their positive reception to and welcome of AUKUS, the Philippines notably. But at the same time, we've also heard the presidential spokesperson, Harry Rock, say that President Duterte has also voiced concern about AUKUS, so we're not quite sure where the Philippines stands on this, and perhaps some of that will be elucidated at next week's ASEAN summitry. So there's a range of receptivity towards AUKUS in particular. And I think those who have been voicing some of their worries about what this means in the long term for regional stability, like Indonesia and Malaysia, those views shouldn't really be dismissed as kind of minority views. I mean, Indonesia is a major player in the region. And one of the missing aspects of the Biden administration's Southeast Asia policy so far has been this lack of a visit to Indonesia in particular, but also to Brunei and Cambodia. Brunei, as we all know, is the current ASEAN chair. Cambodia is the incoming ASEAN chair. So for all the support about ASEAN centrality, there hasn't actually been much beyond lip service. There have been multiple visits to selected countries in Southeast Asia that are perceived to be more like-minded, Singapore and Vietnam in particular. And so we wait to see over the next few months whether there will be an ASEAN ambassador appointed, whether some of the remaining posts in Southeast Asia will be filled, and whether there will actually be more than just this lip service to ASEAN centrality, beyond just picking a select few from within Southeast Asia to work with.
Okay, I'd like to pick up on some of the themes there, particularly to do with Southeast Asia. But first, I just encourage the audience to, if you have any questions that pop up during the discussion, please put them into the Q&A box, because we do have a fair amount of time at the end of the panel for questions. So keep them coming. Susannah, can I just ask you, we just heard a bit there from Elina, a very good context for the US-India, what the US is doing with ASEAN and how the Quad and AUKUS have been received in this region. But how do those trends affect Australia's engagement with Southeast Asia? You know, again, it's a big topic because the countries in the region are so diverse, but certainly there have been a few misgivings expressed, I guess, about what's been happening in recent months. But what's your take?
Yeah, well, I think there's been a shift in Australia's approach to the region, which is kind of yet to fully shake out in terms of the impact that it has on our relationships in Southeast Asia. So over the past couple of years, we've moved to a much more kind of robust approach to the Indo-Pacific, in which we seem to be conceiving of ourselves more as part of a US-led balancing coalition against China, whereas previously we'd always been quite careful to distinguish ourselves and not depict ourselves as part of that competition or balancing. And arrangements like the Quad and AUKUS, I think, changed that sort of balance in Australia's policy. It would be naive to think that this will not affect our relationships in Southeast Asia, whether for better or for worse, but it will have an impact. And I just want to echo what Elina said about Southeast Asian views of AUKUS, because I think it's really important to bear in mind that, you know, there are kind of two strains of thinking. This is a bit of a generalization, but there are sort of two strains of thinking in the region about arrangements like AUKUS. One is that China is a problem and that we need robust US balancing to help manage the China threat. And the other is the kind of the plague on both your houses thinking. So the idea that both the US and China are contributors to a more tense and unstable region. And those two strains of thinking are found to differing degrees across all countries in the region, including Australia. So it would be a mistake to just dismiss the concerns expressed by Indonesia and Malaysia and to say that those are only in those countries, because as Elina pointed out, you also hear those similar concerns expressed in countries like the Philippines, which are otherwise supportive. So Australia needs to sort of seriously reckon with that. And I think, you know, the best case scenario is that we continue to work very practically with countries on their priorities while simultaneously pursuing our strategic objectives with a narrower coalition. You leave the door open to the narrow coalition because you never know who might fall through it one day, and you might be able to work in a different way with other countries as well. The worst case scenario is that we wrongly assume that everyone in the region secretly supports what we're doing, because that will lead us to all kinds of problems.
Sure. I'll just there's a question that's come in that's sort of focused on the region, and I might flick it to you, Elina, because it sort of fits with the point you made about how the US hasn't yet gone to Brunei and Cambodia. Since in the last 6 months, we've had Lloyd Austin and Kamala Harris in the region. They went to Singapore and Vietnam, both of them. So do we think the US approach has sort of become more functional and even, economical in the region? So this is the question from William Chong, in terms of is it working, and so very focused, so that they're picking out the ones who they think they can achieve more traction with in this free and open Indo-Pacific strategy.
Sure, from the window of the White House or the State Department or Defense Department in Washington, that makes sense. But how does that square with this rhetorical support for ASEAN centrality, and what does it mean in the longer term if there are greater fissures that are going to be created from this pick and mix, or pick and select from amongst the region approach that the US is currently taking? I think one of the concerns is that while the US charges China with splitting partners and allies in the region, the US might actually inadvertently be doing the same with the selective approach. So that also contributes to some of the hand-wringing and angst that goes on within ASEAN at some of these meetings, because there is, as Susannah noted, there are varying degrees of concern about China, but also about the US in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, it's certainly been interesting to see the approach. Look, we would be very remiss of us not to talk about Taiwan, which has very much been in the headlines recently. I wonder, Richard, if I could ask you to talk about what the US under Biden is doing as far as the Taiwan policy goes, and perhaps what they should be doing. And we've seen some pretty impressive saber rattling from China recently. Is this sort of more of the same, or is it a worrying sort of escalation?
It's definitely worrying. And I think the core problem here, Emma, is that the dynamic that's sustained a kind of uneasy status quo over Taiwan for quite a long time is now eroding quite significantly. And there are a number of factors for that. A very important one is that we're now seeing in Taiwan the full expression of a very distinct Taiwanese identity. The second is, of course, that's coinciding with a China that's changed very significantly under Xi Jinping, a much more assertive foreign policy, a less patient foreign policy. We've got a much more nationalist China, and also critically, we've got a much more capable Chinese military. So, the ability of China in a military sense to put pressure on Taiwan has grown significantly. And all of those factors are driving this intensified Chinese pressure. I should say that most people who watch this issue very, very closely don't think that a full-on invasion of Taiwan is imminent. China would very much prefer to win without fighting. It wants to wear down the Taiwanese military, wear down the Taiwanese people. It wants to give an impression that unification is inevitable and it's futile to resist it. But still, we can't be certain how much that calculus, the cost, how much cost they're prepared to wear to force unification might change in coming years, particularly as China's military modernization rolls on. So it is a very precarious position for us, and short of full-on conflict, there are many more ways in which China can put coercive pressure on Taiwan. So what can we do about it? I think the Biden administration is trying to walk an appropriately fine line here. What they're trying to do is to tell the Chinese that America does not support a change in the status quo, so they wouldn't support a declaration of independence by Taiwan, for example, and that they will continue to give strong support to Taiwan, but there will be limits to that. So that's one sort of path they're walking, and on the other hand, they are doing what they can to bolster Taiwan's security and to try and give Taiwan as much international space as is possible. I think that's sensible and prudent, even if it's very difficult. A second thing that has to be done really goes to Taiwan's own capability and will to fight. You know, there's quite a robust debate in military circles in America and in Australia and other countries like Japan about whether Taiwan is actually spending enough on its own defense and spending the money on the right sorts of capabilities. So that's another thing that's really important. I think thirdly, we've seen, particularly this year, an attempt to internationalize concerns about Taiwan. So we've seen Taiwan raised in meetings like the G7. It's being talked about in the Quad. Japan has been very clear about how much Taiwan security matters to itself. And that further internationalization is really important to make it clear to China's leaders that this is not just a matter between it and Taiwan and America, that many other countries have a big stake in this. And I think that leads me to my last point about what we can do, which is to be very clear with China's leaders that any attempt to force unification of Taiwan would not be seen as a fait accompli by the world, that it would come with very significant costs to China, and that it would be a folly to underestimate our collective willingness to respond to a forcible unification of Taiwan. So it's an immensely challenging situation, but we're not without agency, and there are things that we can do to help manage tensions down and support Taiwan.
Just to stick with Taiwan for a moment, Ashley, you mentioned at the beginning that we are still waiting for the formal, Indo-Pacific policy from the US. Do you think we've got quite a lot of clarity on the Biden approach to Taiwan?
Well, look, in a defense sense, we don't yet have a national defense strategy. I guess we expect that after the NSS, the National Security Strategy, and the Indo-Pacific Strategy. And the national defense strategy will, we expect, give some clarity on how the administration views deterrence. Does it still want to stick with the Trump administration's fairly pointed framing of a deterrence by denial strategy, which, by the way, was always there in US policy, but was really re-emphasized during the Trump years, and which I think is really what is important for the security of that first island chain in which Japan, Taiwan, Philippines sits. And also, whether or not they see deterrence by denial that is preventing China from gaining what it wants to gain in that first island chain, including in Taiwan, at acceptable levels of cost and risk, whether they view that as the appropriate strategy, in which case all of the points Richard just made with regards to strengthening Taiwan's capabilities, its will to fight, its capacity to fight is really important. But I would say goes even further, and it's actually strengthening the capacity and will to support that denial-based strategy by Taiwan amongst other US allies and partners in Asia before the fact, not just in terms of a response. And it's certainly at this point in time a little unclear as to whether the administration is going to go down that path, or whether in fact the debate which is currently underway in favor of more of a response strategy, a horizontal escalation strategy, which would de-emphasize at some level the forward military-based elements of US strategy and double down on the response, the punishment, the other costs that could be imposed on China were they to try to seize Taiwan. So I don't think we have clarity on that at the moment. And I do think that that's a problem. I think that the other point I want to make on this is that in US strategic and defense circles, there is a real debate, and certainly I think a general consensus that the balance of the 2020s is the most dangerous period when it comes certainly to Taiwan and possibly to China's potential use of military power in Asia more broadly. And there are different reasons for this. In fact, people come at this question in very different ways, but the consensus seems to be that China's military will have sufficiently modernized and be sufficiently operationally capable by mid-decade, certainly by the 26, 27 years, and America's investment in new, very capable future technologies won't yet have come online. And that window of opportunity for a range of different reasons, whether China's on the ascent or the descent, could be capitalized on. I think that's in part why this internationalization of the Taiwan issue has been pursued very urgently, and that's another point of continuity between the Trump and the Biden administrations. I also think it sheds some light on this other debate that we've had this morning about, Australia's changing role as a balancer in the region. I think all of this is premised on the fact that there is now a shared sense in Washington, Canberra, Tokyo, and other parts of the region that the United States can't play its traditional role. The United States cannot extend conventional military deterrence and defend its allies by itself, and that increasingly other Asian allies and partners, and I include Australia in that, will need to play varying kinds of supportive roles. That's not to say that we're going to be having boots on the ground in every potential regional contingency or deterrence posture, but it is to say that I think there's an awareness of that is what lies behind this fairly important step up in Australia's active regional strategy and framing of it in those terms, Japan as well, and that is unlikely to change quickly.
I think we focused quite a lot on the military side of things and defence strategy, but we did hear earlier on in the Biden administration about this Build Back Better initiative, and there is one for the US, but there's also an international component. And I wonder, Susannah, if I could ask you to sort of answer some of the audience's questions about this. We've had one from Amrita Mali at Save the Children. Do we think this Build Back Better has a chance of succeeding? And we've also got one from Wong Leku. Greetings to all the panelists. Can you elaborate more on this Build Back Better and how it could also bring in the post-COVID recovery? And I think, Susannah, we did speak a bit about this, about how the US could be doing more in a unified pattern across Southeast Asia. So yeah, what's your view on this Build Back Better?
Well, I think the question about whether or not it can be successful is a really interesting one, because I guess that draws the question then, what is success in this context? And if by success we mean sort of countering China's Belt and Road Initiative, which in any case seems to be sort of declining in terms of the level of effort and resources that is going into that, then I think it is a bit questionable, because infrastructure is probably best conceived of as a long-term investment, especially when you're talking about infrastructure that relies on private capital. It's not a deployable asset where the US can just say, okay, we need to build our influence in this strategically important country. We're going to make this happen, within a period of say months. That's just not realistic. It's going to be a long-term investment, and over decades. Yes, I think something like Build Back Better World Initiative could be really valuable, but I think one question that I have about it is really, to what extent is it going to be focused on the region that is of greatest strategic importance in the competition with China, that being the Indo-Pacific, and particularly in Southeast Asia, because we've seen from the G7 that this initiative is at a global level. Now, if that means that there are significant additional investments from European countries to kind of lift the overall level of resources available, then that is good. But we don't know that. And the G7 aspect of it, we've heard that projects would be discussed at the next summit. So that's, again, taking a long time. And if it means that the focus is diluted away from the Indo-Pacific and towards a more global approach, then I think that should be of concern.
if we're looking at events that are coming up very soon, the ASEAN Summit, I think, Elina, you touched upon ASEAN Summitary Week. I think it's next week. And we do have a question from Hunter Marsden. With the summits coming up, do you see a window of opportunity for the Biden administration to work with ASEAN to coordinate a more effective diplomatic strategy to deal with the Myanmar crisis? Now, there's a question for you.
Yeah, I suppose it also depends on what effective means. And obviously the question of Myanmar is very complicated. If not, we would already have solved it years in advance. I think the US is already doing a lot of the groundwork in the run-up to the summits next week. You see this, for example, in Councillor Derek Choi's trip to the region, his visits and discussions with in Singapore, for example, to try to restrict international access for the Myanmar regime's accounts held overseas. So a lot of that is prefacing, I think, what will be further discussions in ASEAN next week. What more can be done? So far, the US has really been quite supportive of ASEAN's role. I know there has been a lot of frustration within and beyond ASEAN about how far ASEAN has gone or not gone in resolving the crisis. But I think it's appreciated within the region that ASEAN has been sort of given this leadership role, so to speak, to try to resolve some of the conflicts and tensions on the ground. Now, whether this patience will eventually run out again within ASEAN and beyond largely depends on Myanmar. And I think that some of the recent developments that we've seen, particularly with the decision to not have Min Aung Hlaing attend the ASEAN summit, I think is a welcome development for ASEAN. Now, whether that will translate into something more substantive is highly improbable in the immediate term. And I think the sooner it is that we come to terms with what exactly ASEAN can and cannot do, then the quicker it is that we can try to adjudge ASEAN for what it really is instead of what we expect it to be.
Thanks, Elina. I think next week might be quite interesting. We're seeing, some real splits happening in ASEAN about Myanmar, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I have a question from Alejandro Reyes. I think, Ash, if you could take this one. So this is talking about rivalry in the US-China rivalry, but in the tech sphere. I mean, we've talked a lot about AUKUS and the submarines, but do we see further decoupling and realignment in the tech field, particularly in regards to strategic tech?
I mean, I think that is a trend that is likely to continue as much because of China's own ambitions to become a leader in strategic tech, artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, quantum and so forth, on the one hand, and also the United States and some of its allies push to strengthen the protections against the sharing of and the input of US resources into sustaining China's tech industries as well at a corporate level. Both of those kinds of defensive measures, if you like, will mean that that project continues to play out, and that will functionally lead to a greater degree of separateness, whether that's decoupling or not. There's a debate around, but I think that is likely to happen. Will AUKUS play a key role in driving this? I don't think so. Let's remember what AUKUS is. AUKUS is not an alliance. AUKUS is a framework for the US and Australia and Britain to do something they've already done more efficiently and hopefully more quickly and with less export controls and ITAR restrictions and impediments to sharing sensitive defense technologies and know-how and technical skills. So to the extent that other aspects of critical technology go through AUKUS in the coming years, and certainly we expect that will and hope that will be the case from an Australian perspective, that is likely to graft greater capacity here in our industrial base and innovation base, but it is not likely itself to be a driver of decoupling.
Okay, thanks. Well, look, we've covered a lot of ground and there's some really fantastic questions coming in, but we are getting close to time. I would like to ask this question that's been put forward by Trevor Rowe. Does the Biden have an Indo-China policy that is sustainable over future US administrations? I really like this question because obviously we have seen so much disruption in US policy through the Trump administration and now the realignment under Biden. So I thought it was a good one to circle back, and it probably will be our last one. Richard, could I ask you to take that one on?
Thanks, Emma, and thanks, Trevor. It's a great question. And of course, it's an incredibly important one. It's one that's on the minds of policymakers everywhere. They won't say so, but it's on the minds of policymakers in Australia. It's certainly on the minds of policymakers in other parts of the region, including in Southeast Asia and Japan and Korea. I think there are two ways of answering this. One way is that there are some inbuilt sustainers of an American Indo-Pacific strategy. The China challenge is not going to go away, as we talked about earlier. There will be strong competition, and America has very significant national interests in this part of the world. And don't forget, there's a lot of continuity between Trump administration policies and Biden administrations on the Indo-Pacific, and it was the Trump administration through its national security and national defense strategies that shifted America's focus very strongly away from the sort of 9/11 counterterrorism era and towards state competition with China in particular. If there is a switch back to the Republicans in the next election, we will see some continuity. I do think there is a pretty big, important but here, though, and it goes to the state of the Republican Party at the moment. There's absolutely no signs of any recalibration or rethinking in the Republican Party about the catastrophic end to the Trump administration. Indeed, really, we're seeing Trump entrench his influence and Trump-like candidates in the party entrenching their influence. So there's no going to be shifting back to a Republican Party of an earlier era. I mean, there's still a very long way to go, I know, but that seems very likely. The Republican Party is still intent on weakening American democracy in quite extraordinary ways, including by taking power away from officials to certify state-level elections and putting it in the hands of political bodies. So if not Trump as a candidate next time around, then likely someone like Trump. And that really probably does presage a return to America first approach to the world, a high degree of nationalism, including economic nationalism, high degree of populism, a divided, polarized America, which will be a weaker one. And if Trump himself, well, Trump has no real framework on China other than he doesn't like the trade deficit and what works for him politically. And a second Trump administration, if that's how it happened, would be, I think, a very wild ride. And that would be very damaging for America's global standing all over again. And from an Australian policymaker perspective and policymakers' perspective in the region, we work with what we've got, which is a Biden administration. We will work with the continuity we might get, but we also have to carefully hedge against the possibility that things might change again quite dramatically.
Mm. I think that's quite sobering, particularly bearing in mind what Ashley said about the what's going to happen in the middle of the decade, I guess, and the different pressures building up to crunch time around there. Certainly a tough time for policymakers, and an interesting time for the rest of us. Look, thanks very much to the panel. We are right on time now, so I think I'll call it to a close, but I think you'll agree. Thank you also to all the audience for joining us. We had great registrations and viewing, so I hope everyone got something out of this. And thanks to US Study Centre and Asia Society for organising.